Dad, please. Don't go inside. Amanda's family is here. Just don't make a scene right now.
Imagine raising your son for 34 years, paying off your house with your own 2 hands. And then one Saturday night, that very same son plants himself in his own doorway and tells you that you're not welcome inside. He didn't yell, he didn't argue, he didn't even blink. David Halverson just turned around, walked down those porch steps, and pulled out his phone before he'd even reached his truck.
They just crossed the line. Start the game, Rebecca. They just crossed the line.
Now, before we get into how a retired water inspector ended up going to war with his own over the deed to his house, I want to know where you're watching this from tonight. Drop it in the comments, because trust me, by the end of this, you're going to have a lot to say. David Halverson spent 31 years running maintenance and compliance for the Portland Municipal Water Authority. For 3 decades, his entire job was making sure nobody in his city got something they didn't expect. He retired 2 years ago with a pension, a paid-off house, and exactly one hobby: annoying his wife, Carol. Carol remembered everyone's birthday, including the mailman's. 26 years as an elementary school secretary meant nothing got past her. Not a lie, not a bad excuse, not a forged anything. Their son Ryan married Amanda 6 years ago. Amanda worked as a senior paralegal at an estate planning firm downtown called Reyes & Blackmore. She was sharp, organized, and color-coded her life. David liked her fine. She remembered how Carol took her coffee. Gary Winslow had been David's best friend for 24 years. Retired postal worker, permanent fixture on the back porch, the kind of friend who shows up uninvited and never leaves too early. Life was simple. Coffee, the garden, Gary's broken machines, Carol complaining that David never listened, and Sunday dinners with their son, Ryan. Ryan was 34, married to Amanda, and as far as David knew, the family was doing just fine. Until one Sunday evening, Amanda started talking about the house. She didn't ask David to sell it. Not directly. She simply asked whether he'd ever considered downsizing. She mentioned the stairs, the property taxes, the maintenance, the cost of keeping such a large house after retirement. David laughed it off. He told her he wasn't moving anywhere. Then Amanda asked whether he had ever thought about leaving the house to Ryan early. David stopped laughing. Ryan looked down at his plate, and that's when David noticed something. His son wasn't surprised. He was scared. David asked Amanda why she was suddenly so interested in his house. Amanda smiled and said she was only thinking about the family's future. Then Ryan quietly said, "Drop it, Amanda." The table went silent. It was the first time David had ever heard his son speak to his wife that way. Later that night, Ryan helped his father carry dishes into the kitchen. David waited until they were alone. Then he asked what was going on. Ryan said nothing. David pushed harder. Ryan finally looked at him and said something that would bother David for months. "Whatever you do, Dad, don't sign anything." David asked what he meant. Ryan wouldn't explain. He simply told his father to trust him. Then he left. David stood in the kitchen staring at the closed door. And for the first time, he wondered if his son's marriage was in serious trouble. He just didn't realize that his own house was sitting right in the middle of it. 3 weeks later, David found an envelope on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to Ryan. It had been delivered to the wrong house. David normally would have called his son, but the envelope wasn't sealed. He saw the name of a financial company. Then a balance. A very large balance. And suddenly, Ryan's strange behavior made a little more sense. David called him. Ryan answered after several rings. David asked what the debt was. Ryan said it wasn't his to explain. That answer made David angry. He reminded Ryan that they were family. Ryan went quiet. Then he said, "Dad, please, just don't get involved." That was exactly the wrong thing to say to a father. The next morning, Amanda showed up at David's house. She was carrying a pie. She smiled. She acted perfectly normal. Then she asked David if he'd opened Ryan's mail. David admitted it. Amanda's smile disappeared. She told him he needed to stay out of their marriage. David reminded her that Ryan was his son. Amanda nodded. Then she asked a question that David would remember for a very long time. How long does Ryan have to wait for his inheritance? David actually laughed. He thought she was joking. She wasn't. David told her he wasn't dead yet. Amanda looked directly at him and said, "That's exactly what Ryan keeps telling me." Then she walked out. David stood in the kitchen alone, and suddenly the pie didn't seem very friendly anymore. That afternoon, David called Gary. Gary listened without interrupting. Then he asked one question. "Have you checked the deed?" David laughed. He called Gary paranoid. Gary didn't laugh. He told David that nobody casually talks about inheritance while the owner of the house is healthy unless something else is happening. David didn't want to believe it. But the next morning, he checked the filing cabinet. The property folder was there. Insurance papers, tax records, mortgage records. Everything looked normal, except one thing. A copy of the deed was missing. David searched everywhere. Nothing. Then he remembered something. 2 months earlier, Ryan had asked to see the property documents. David had given him access without thinking twice. Now he called his son. Ryan didn't answer. Hours later, Ryan called back. David asked if he'd taken the deed. Silence. Then Ryan said yes. David asked why. Another silence. David asked the question that mattered most. Is Amanda trying to get this house? Ryan didn't answer. And somehow, that was worse than a yes. David hung up. For the first time in 34 years, he wondered whether his own son was lying to him. That night, Carol noticed something was wrong. David finally told her everything. Amanda's questions. The debt. The missing deed. Ryan's silence. Carol listened carefully. Then she said something David wasn't expecting. Amanda had been calling her too. Not once. 4 times. And every conversation somehow came back to the same subjects. David's will, his pension, the house, and whether Ryan would eventually inherit everything. David stared at his wife. He asked what she told Amanda. Carol said she'd told her to mind her own business. David almost smiled. That sounded like Carol. Then her expression changed. She admitted Amanda had asked something else. She had asked whether David had ever considered adding Ryan to the deed. David's smile disappeared. He asked Carol why she hadn't told him. Carol hesitated. And that hesitation told David there was something else. Something bigger. David asked, "Carol, what aren't you telling me?" Carol looked down. Then she said, "David, I think you need to talk to Rebecca." Rebecca Carter was an attorney who had handled some of their legal paperwork years earlier. David asked why. Carol wouldn't explain. She only said, "Please trust me." David was starting to hate those words. Everyone wanted him to trust them. Nobody wanted to tell him the truth. Rebecca's office was quiet. Too quiet. She placed a thick folder in front of David. Then she told him something that made his stomach tighten. Carol had come to see her months earlier. About Amanda. David opened the folder. Inside were financial statements, loan applications, emails, property documents, and several notes. Rebecca explained that Amanda's family had been struggling financially. A business investment had gone bad. Then another. Amanda had accumulated serious debt. But the debt itself wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was what Amanda had started looking for. A way to use David's paid-off house as security. David stared at the paperwork. He asked whether Amanda had tried to put the house up as collateral. Rebecca said the evidence suggested she had been exploring ways to do exactly that. Then David saw something that stopped him cold. A note in Carol's handwriting. It said, "David will blame himself if he finds out." David read it twice. Then Rebecca showed him another line. "Ryan knows. He promised to protect his father." David leaned back. His wife knew. His son knew. Rebecca knew. And David had been the only person walking around his own house without knowing what was happening. But then Rebecca said something that changed the entire story. "David, there's something you need to understand." He looked at her. "Your son isn't helping Amanda." David frowned. Rebecca continued. "He's been trying to stop her." David drove home furious. Not at Amanda. Not yet. He was furious at Ryan. Because if Ryan knew all of this, why had he allowed his father to believe he was hiding something? Carol finally told him. Ryan had discovered that Amanda wasn't simply interested in the house. She was trying to create a story around David. A story that he was becoming forgetful. That he was struggling with his finances. That he was making poor decisions. Amanda had started collecting little incidents. A missed appointment. A misplaced set of keys. A forgotten bill. Nothing serious. Nothing that would alarm David. But put enough small incidents together, and Amanda could tell people a different story. She could make David look incapable of managing his own property. David felt sick, because now he understood. Amanda wasn't just trying to get his house. She was trying to make it look like David couldn't protect it. And Ryan had discovered the plan. That's why Ryan had been distant. That's why he had taken the deed. That's why he kept telling his father not to sign anything. But David still had one question. Why hadn't Ryan simply told him? Carol's answer was painful. Because Ryan knew his father, David would have confronted Amanda immediately. He would have stormed into her house. He would have demanded answers. And if Amanda knew Ryan had exposed her too early, she could destroy the evidence. So Ryan made a terrible choice. He let his father believe he was the enemy, because he thought that was the only way to protect him. For the next few weeks, David watched his son carefully. Ryan continued acting distant. He still wouldn't explain everything. Sometimes he sat in his truck outside David's house for 10 minutes before leaving. Sometimes he called late at night and asked whether David had signed anything. David finally understood why. But he still didn't know what Ryan was protecting him from. Then came Saturday night. David learned Amanda's parents and brother were at Ryan's house. Nobody had invited him. Nobody had explained why. David drove over. When Ryan opened the door, David could see several people inside. He asked what was happening. Ryan told him to go home. David refused. He stepped forward, and Ryan moved. He planted himself directly in the doorway, both arms stretched across it, blocking his father. David stopped. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. 6 months of questions. 6 months of secrets. 6 months of wondering whether his son had chosen his wife over him. David told Ryan to move. Ryan didn't. David asked what was inside. Ryan said, "Dad, you are not going into that room while my wife's family is here." David asked why. Ryan's eyes filled with tears. David asked whether Amanda was trying to take his house. Ryan still didn't answer. David stepped closer. He told his son, "If you're protecting her, get out of my way." Ryan's face broke. And finally he said, "I'm not protecting her." David froze. Ryan swallowed hard. "I'm protecting you." That was the moment everything changed. David asked what was in the room. Ryan looked behind him, then back at his father. Documents, emails, bank records, and evidence that Amanda's family had been discussing how to pressure David into giving up control of the house. But there was one more thing. Something Ryan hadn't told David. Something about Carol. Ryan finally admitted that his mother had known about the plan months earlier. And before David could ask anything else, Ryan said, "Mum made me promise." David's face changed. "Promise what?" Ryan's eyes filled again. "To protect you." The next morning, David, Ryan, Carol, and Rebecca sat together. No more secrets. No more half-truths. No more "trust me." Rebecca laid everything out. Amanda had been drowning financially. She had convinced her family that David's house could solve their problems. She had pressured Ryan to convince his father to transfer control. When Ryan refused, Amanda began turning him against his father. She wanted David to believe Ryan was after the house. She wanted Ryan to believe David was becoming incapable. She wanted the father and son separated, because once they stopped trusting each other, Amanda would have a much easier path. But Ryan had quietly fought back. He collected messages. He saved financial records. He copied documents. He worked with Rebecca. And he deliberately allowed his father to think he was hiding something. Because he needed time. David finally understood every strange moment. Every unanswered call. Every warning. Every time Ryan told him not to sign something. Every time his son looked like he wanted to say something. And stopped. David had thought Ryan was pulling away. Ryan had actually been moving closer to the danger, so he could keep it away from his father. David looked at his son and asked the question he'd been afraid to ask. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Ryan looked down, then said, "Because I knew you'd go after her." David almost laughed. "Because that was true." Ryan continued, "And if you went after her before we had proof, we'd lose everything." David looked toward Carol. She was crying. Then he understood the final piece. Carol hadn't betrayed him either. She and Ryan had been working together. His entire family had been hiding the truth from him, but not because they wanted his house. Because they were trying to save him from the person who did. Amanda eventually faced the consequences of her actions. The suspicious property documents were challenged. David's house remained his. His financial accounts were secured. And Ryan eventually walked away from the marriage. But those legal victories weren't what David remembered most. He remembered the doorway. Months later, David and Ryan sat together on the porch. Gary was in the garage, still fighting with that same lawnmower. Carol was inside making coffee. David looked at Ryan. He asked whether he remembered that Saturday night. Ryan laughed. He admitted he thought his father was going to knock him through the door. David laughed too. Then the laughter faded. David told his son he had spent 6 months believing Ryan had betrayed him. Ryan looked down. He said he understood. Then David said something Ryan didn't expect. He apologized. He apologized for judging his son before knowing the whole story. Ryan apologized too. He admitted that protecting someone with silence can sometimes hurt the very person you're trying to protect. David looked at the front door. The same doorway Ryan had blocked with both arms. And finally, he understood what it had really meant. Ryan hadn't been keeping his father out. He had been keeping danger from getting in. David spent his life believing protection meant building walls. A strong house. A secure bank account. A paid-off mortgage. But his son had protected him in a completely different way. He had taken the blame. He had allowed his father to misunderstand him. He had risked his marriage. He had risked his relationship with the man who mattered most to him. Also, David wouldn't lose what he'd spent his entire life building. And that was the lesson David never forgot. Sometimes the person who suddenly becomes distant isn't abandoning you. Sometimes they're fighting a battle you can't see. Sometimes the silence isn't betrayal. Sometimes it's fear. And sometimes the person standing directly in your way isn't trying to stop you from moving forward. They're trying to stop something dangerous from reaching you. David thought his son was blocking a doorway. He didn't realize Ryan was drawing a line. And on the other side of that line was everything David had spent his entire life trying to protect. His home, his family, his future. But most importantly, the trust between a father and the son who had never really betrayed him. Because sometimes love doesn't look like a hug. Sometimes it looks like a warning. Sometimes it looks like silence. And sometimes it looks like your grown son standing in front of a doorway with both arms stretched wide, telling you, "Not this time, Dad." And years later, David would finally understand what Ryan had really been saying. Not, "You can't come in," but, "Nothing is getting past me to hurt you."